At 6:23 a.m. on February 21st, 1945, Private First Class Vincent Anthony Caruso dropped into a shell crater on the black sand of Iwo Jima and watched his entire platoon die. The Japanese machine gun had opened up from a concealed pillbox 60 yards ahead, its Type 92 heavy machine gun sweeping the beach in methodical bursts, and the men of 3rd Platoon, Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 27th Marines had walked directly into its kill zone. 18 men had started across that stretch of volcanic sand. In 11 seconds, 14 of them were down. Caruso was 19 years old, a steelworker's son from Braddock, Pennsylvania, 4 months out of boot camp at Parris Island, and he had never seen combat before this morning. He had grown up in the shadow of the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, where his father and grandfather had worked, where the furnaces ran day and night and the sky glowed orange after dark. He had dropped out of high school at 17 to take a job at the mill, had spent a year hauling scrap and learning the trade, had been preparing for a life of 12-hour shifts and union meetings when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. He had enlisted the week after his 18th birthday, choosing the Marines because his uncle had served with them in the First War. Boot camp at Parris Island had been 8 weeks of hell, the drill instructors screaming, the endless runs through the Carolina swamps, the constant reminder that the men who washed out would be assigned to less prestigious branches. Caruso had not washed out. He had been too stubborn, too proud, too determined to prove that a mill kid from Pennsylvania could be a Marine. He had trained for this. He had practiced beach assaults on the shores of Hawaii, had fired thousands of rounds at plywood targets, had listened to veterans describe what battle was really like. None of it had prepared him for this. Nothing could prepare anyone for this. The M2 flamethrower on his back weighed 68 pounds. The twin tanks contained 4 gallons of thickened fuel, a napalm mixture that would burn at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The effective range was 40 yards. The fuel supply would last approximately 7 seconds of continuous fire. Caruso had been designated the platoon's flamethrower operator because he was big enough to carry the weight. 6'2", 210 pounds, built like the steel mill worker he had been before the war. He had never used the weapon in combat. He had never even seen it used in combat. Now he was lying in a hole in the ground, the screams of wounded men filling his ears, and somewhere ahead of him was a machine gun that would kill anyone who tried to move. Iwo Jima was supposed to be a 3-day operation. That's what the brass had told them during the briefings on the transport ships. The island was 8 square miles of volcanic rock, defended by maybe 13,000 Japanese troops, and the combined might of the United States Marine Corps would overwhelm it in 72 hours. Air support would neutralize the enemy positions. Naval bombardment would destroy the fortifications. The Marines would land, advance, and plant the flag on Mount Suribachi before the week was out. The brass had been wrong, catastrophically, tragically wrong. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi had spent 8 months preparing Iwo Jima for the American assault. He had abandoned the traditional Japanese doctrine of defending at the waterline, recognizing that American naval firepower would annihilate any troops exposed on the beaches. Instead, he had ordered his 21,000 men, nearly twice the intelligence estimate, to dig. They had excavated 11 miles of tunnels connecting over 1,500 fortified positions. They had built pillboxes with walls of reinforced concrete 4 feet thick, impervious to anything short of a direct hit from a battleship's main guns. They had positioned their weapons to create interlocking fields of fire so that any position attacked from the front would be supported by positions on the flanks. The Japanese had turned Iwo Jima into a fortress, and the Marines had walked right into it. The first waves had landed at 9 a.m. on February 19th. For 20 minutes, there had been almost no resistance. The Japanese were waiting, letting the beaches fill with men and equipment, letting the Marines believe that the naval bombardment had done its job. Then, at 9:20 a.m., Kuribayashi had given the order to open fire. The killing had been methodical and merciless. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, all of it pre-registered on the landing beaches, all of it coordinated to create overlapping zones of death. The black volcanic sand, too loose for running and too soft for digging, had trapped the Marines on the beach like insects on fly paper. By nightfall on the first day, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions had suffered over 2,400 casualties. By the end of the second day, that number had nearly doubled. Now it was the morning of the third day, and Caruso's platoon had been ordered to advance inland from Yellow Beach toward the first airfield. They had made it perhaps 200 yards before the machine gun had found them. The pillbox was almost invisible. The Japanese had built it into a natural depression in the volcanic rock, had covered it with sand and camouflage netting, had left only a narrow firing slit that was impossible to see until the gun started shooting. The Type 92 heavy machine gun, the Marines called it the woodpecker because of its distinctive sound, could fire 450 rounds per minute, and its crew had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment. Caruso lay in his crater and tried to think. The machine gun was too far away for him to reach with the flamethrower. Even if he could get close enough, he would have to cross 60 yards of open ground with a weapon that made him the most visible target on the battlefield. The tanks on his back were filled with volatile fuel that would explode if hit by a single bullet. He would be dead before he covered half the distance. But the machine gun had to be destroyed. As long as it remained operational, no one could advance. The platoon survivors, there were only 4 of them now, huddled in shell craters within shouting distance, would be pinned down until Japanese mortars found their range. And once the mortars started falling, there would be no survivors at all. Caruso! The voice belonged to Corporal Raymond Dominguez, the senior man left alive, a 24-year-old from El Paso who had fought on Saipan and knew exactly how bad their situation was. Caruso, can you see the pillbox? I see it, Corporal. Can you hit it from here? No! Too far! I need to get closer! A burst of machine gun fire raked the sand above Caruso's head, close enough that he felt the heat of the passing rounds. The Japanese gunner had seen movement, was probing for targets, would eventually find them all. Time was running out. There's a drainage ditch, Dominguez shouted. 20 yards to your left. It runs toward the pillbox. You might be able to use it for cover. Caruso turned his head, searching for the ditch. He saw it. A shallow depression in the volcanic rock, carved by rainwater, maybe 2 feet deep. Not enough to fully conceal a man, but enough to reduce his profile. If he could reach it, if he could crawl along its length, he might be able to get within range of the pillbox. And then what? Then he would stand up in front of a machine gun and hope that a 4-gallon tank of burning napalm could kill the men inside before they killed him. The math was not encouraging. "I'm gonna try," Caruso shouted. "Caruso, wait!" But he was already moving. He had learned at Paris Island that hesitation killed Marines, that the only way to survive combat was to act before fear could paralyze you. He rolled out of his crater and sprinted for the drainage ditch, the 68-pound flamethrower bouncing on his back, the volcanic sand sucking at his boots with every step. The machine gun opened up immediately. The Japanese gunner had been watching for exactly this kind of movement, and his first burst passed so close to Caruso's head that he felt the shockwave against his cheek. He dove, hit the ground hard, and rolled into the drainage ditch with the gracelessness of a man who had just discovered that he very much wanted to live. If you want to see how a teenager with a flamethrower took on a fortified machine gun nest and changed the course of a battle, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Caruso. The drainage ditch was shallower than it had looked from his crater, 2 feet deep at most, barely enough to cover a man lying prone, and Caruso was not a small man. He pressed himself into the volcanic rock, feeling the sharp edges dig into his chest and stomach, and began to crawl. The flamethrower made everything harder. The twin tanks caught on rocks, snagged on debris, shifted his center of gravity in ways that threatened to roll him out of the ditch and into the machine gun's line of fire. The wand, the ignition device that he would use to fire the weapon, dragged in the sand beside him, collecting grit that might cause it to malfunction at the worst possible moment. Sweat ran into his eyes, mixing with the volcanic dust, stinging until he could barely see. His elbows and knees were raw within the first 20 yards, the black sand abrading through the fabric of his dungarees. Caruso crawled anyway, 1 agonizing yard at a time, while the machine gun searched for him above. The smell was something he would never forget. Sulfur from the volcanic rock, cordite from the explosions, and underneath it all, the sweet, sick odor of death. The beach was littered with bodies, Marines who had been cut down in the first hours of the assault, their corpses baking in the tropical sun. Some of them had been his friends, some of them he had never met. Now they were all the same, obstacles to crawl past, reminders of what would happen if he failed. The Japanese gunner knew he was coming. The firing pattern changed, became more focused, the bursts sweeping back and forth across the area around the drainage ditch. Rock chips and sand flew with each burst, and Caruso could hear the distinctive crack of rounds passing inches above his body. The gunner couldn't see him, not yet, but he knew approximately where he was. It was only a matter of time before a burst found its mark. 20 yards, 30 yards. Caruso crawled past the body of a Marine he didn't recognize, a young man with red hair and freckles who had taken a burst across the chest. He crawled past a discarded rifle, past a helmet with a hole punched through the crown, past all the detritus of a battle that had already killed too many men. 40 yards. The ditch was getting shallower. Ahead, he could see where it tapered into nothing, where the volcanic rock rose to meet the level of the beach. Beyond that point, there was no cover. He would have to stand up, advance across open ground, and attack the pillbox directly. He was approximately 30 yards from the machine gun now, at the edge of his weapon's effective range. If he stood up here, if he fired from this position, the napalm might reach the pillbox. Might. Or it might fall short, and he would have wasted his only shot while standing in the open with an empty weapon. He needed to get closer. The last 10 yards were the worst. The ditch had effectively disappeared, leaving only a slight depression in the rock that offered almost no protection. Caruso crawled on his belly like a snake, pressing himself so flat against the ground that he could feel his heartbeat against the volcanic sand. The machine gun continued to fire, but the bursts were going high now, the gunner apparently convinced that his target was still back in the deeper part of the ditch. At 20 yards, Caruso stopped. He was as close as he could get without being seen. The pillbox was directly ahead, a low concrete structure, half buried in the sand, with a firing slit perhaps 18 inches high and 3 feet wide. He could see the muzzle flash of the machine gun inside, could see the brass casings ejecting with each burst, could almost see the faces of the men who were trying to kill him. He had 7 seconds of fuel. 7 seconds to destroy a fortified position that had already killed 14 Marines. 7 seconds to do something that might be brave, or might be suicidal, or might be both. Caruso stood up. The Japanese gunner saw him immediately. The machine gun swung toward him, the barrel tracking his movement, and Caruso knew he had perhaps 1 second before the first rounds found his chest. He did not think. He did not aim. He simply pointed the wand at the pillbox and squeezed the trigger. The flamethrower roared. A stream of liquid fire erupted from the nozzle, a river of burning napalm that crossed the 20 yards between Caruso and the pillbox in less than a heartbeat. The napalm hit the concrete face of the fortification, splashed through the firing slit, and poured into the interior like water through a drain. The machine gun stopped mid-burst. Then the screaming started. Caruso held the trigger down, sweeping the flame back and forth across the pillbox, making certain that every inch of the firing slit was covered. The napalm clung to everything it touched, burning at temperatures that would melt steel, filling the enclosed space with fire and smoke and the toxic fumes of burning fuel. The screams from inside lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then they stopped, and the only sound was the roar of the flamethrower and the crackle of burning concrete. The fuel ran out at the 6-second mark. Caruso released the trigger and stood there, the empty wand in his hands, watching the pillbox burn. Smoke was pouring from the firing slit, thick and black, and carrying the smell of things he did not want to identify. Nothing moved inside. Nothing would ever move inside again. He became aware that he was still alive. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and his legs nearly buckled. He had charged a machine gun. He had run toward a weapon that had killed 14 men in 11 seconds, and he was still standing. Caruso! Corporal Dominguez was running toward him, the other 2 survivors close behind. Jesus Christ, Caruso, are you hit? Are you okay? Caruso looked down at himself. His dungarees were torn, his hands were shaking, and there was blood on his face from a cut he didn't remember receiving, but he was intact. Somehow, impossibly, he was intact. "I'm okay," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant and hollow. "I'm okay." Dominguez grabbed his shoulder, turned him, checked him for wounds. Then the corporal looked at the burning pillbox, at the smoke still rising from the firing slit, and shook his head slowly. "That was the craziest thing I've ever seen," he said. "You just charged a goddamn machine gun nest." "It was the only way," Caruso said. "Someone had to do it." "Yeah, but no one ever does." Dominguez looked at him with an expression that Caruso couldn't quite read. Respect, maybe, or something closer to fear. "You know you just saved our lives, right? All of us. We were dead if that gun stayed operational." The other two survivors had reached them now. Private First Class Tommy Kaczynski, a Polish kid from Chicago who had joined the Marines to escape the stockyards, and Private Albert Moore, a farmer's son from Oklahoma who had lied about his age to enlist at 16. They stood in a loose semicircle around Caruso, staring at the burning pillbox, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. Caruso didn't answer Dominguez's question. He was looking past the corporal, past the burning pillbox, toward the terrain that lay ahead. The first airfield was visible in the distance, maybe 300 yards away. Between here and there, he could see at least 3 more fortified positions, their outlines barely visible against the volcanic rock. "There are more of them," he said. Dominguez followed his gaze. "Yeah, a lot more." "Then we keep going." The destruction of the pillbox had done more than save the survivors of 3rd Platoon. It had broken the Japanese defensive line on this section of the beach, had created a gap that other Marines could exploit. Within minutes, word of Caruso's attack had spread along the line, and men who had been pinned down for hours began to move forward, using the burning pillbox as a landmark, pushing toward the airfield that was the day's objective. By noon, Fox Company had advanced nearly 400 yards. By nightfall, they had reached the edge of the first airfield, had dug in against the inevitable Japanese counterattack, had established positions that would anchor the Marine advance for the next 3 days. The breakthrough had started with a single man and a flamethrower. But the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over, and Vincent Caruso's war had only just begun. Over the next 4 days, Caruso destroyed 7 more fortified positions. He became something of a legend in 2nd Battalion, the big kid from Pennsylvania who would go anywhere, attack anything, who seemed to believe that the flamethrower on his back made him invincible. Other Marines would mark enemy positions for him, would provide covering fire while he maneuvered into range, would watch in awe as he stood up in the face of enemy fire and turned concrete bunkers into crematoriums. He was wounded on February 24th when a Japanese sniper's bullet grazed his left arm while he was crawling toward a mortar position. He refused evacuation, allowed a corpsman to bandage the wound, and went back into action within an hour. He was wounded again on February 25th when a grenade fragment lodged in his right thigh. Again he refused evacuation. The battalion surgeon told him he was crazy. Caruso told the surgeon that there were still bunkers to burn. The turning point came on February 26th, the 8th day of the battle. Fox Company had been ordered to assault a complex of fortifications near the base of Mount Suribachi. The position was a nightmare. 3 interconnected pillboxes with overlapping fields of fire, protected by minefields, and covered by at least 2 mortar teams. 2 previous assaults had failed, costing the company 11 dead and 19 wounded. The position had earned a nickname among the Marines, the Meat Grinder. Caruso studied the position for nearly an hour, watching the firing patterns, identifying the dead zones, looking for any approach that might give him a chance. The other Marines watched him, saying nothing, knowing what he was planning. By now, they all knew. When Vincent Caruso studied a position like that, it meant someone was about to die, usually the enemy. "I can't get all 3, Caruso told Dominguez, who had been promoted to sergeant after the platoon's losses. "Not with 1 tank of fuel. I can maybe get 2, but the 3rd one will cut me down." "Then don't try it," Dominguez said. "We'll call in naval gunfire. Wait for them to soften it up." "Naval gunfire hasn't touched these positions in a week. They're too well protected, and every hour we wait, more Marines die." Caruso shook his head. "I need a diversion, something to draw fire from the 3rd pillbox while I hit the first 2. Dominguez was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll do it. I'll take a fire team around the left flank, make noise, draw their attention. You hit the right side, take out what you can." "Sarge, that's suicide. They'll cut you apart." "Maybe." Dominguez smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. But you've been walking into machine gun fire for a week, and you're still here. Maybe some of that luck will rub off on me." The assault began at 2:15 p.m. Dominguez led 4 Marines around the left flank, firing as they moved, creating the illusion of a larger force. The Japanese responded exactly as Caruso had predicted, shifting their fire toward the apparent threat, leaving the right side of the position momentarily weakened. Caruso moved. He covered the first 30 yards at a dead sprint, the flamethrower bouncing on his back, his legs driving through the volcanic sand. A burst of machine gun fire tracked toward him, but it was too slow, the gunner distracted by Dominguez's diversion. Caruso dove into a shell crater, rolled, and came up within 15 yards of the first pillbox. The first burst of napalm caught the pillbox's firing slit at an angle, splashing across the concrete face and pouring inside. The machine gun went silent. Caruso was already moving, sprinting toward the second position, the burning wreckage of the first pillbox covering his advance. The second pillbox saw him coming. The machine gun swung toward him, and Caruso saw the muzzle flash, felt something tug at his dungaree jacket, knew that rounds were passing inches from his body. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He pointed the wand and fired. The napalm stream fell short by perhaps 3 feet. The burning fuel splashed against the base of the pillbox, igniting the sand, but it didn't penetrate the firing slit. Caruso cursed, adjusted his aim, and fired again. This time, the napalm went through. 2 down, 1 to go, but his fuel gauge was showing empty, and the third pillbox was already firing at him. He dropped flat as the machine gun rounds tore through the air above his head. The fuel tanks on his back were empty, nothing but dead weight now. He was lying in the open, 30 yards from an active machine gun, with no weapon capable of stopping it. Then Dominguez hit the third pillbox from the flank. The sergeant had led his fire team through a drainage ditch that no one had noticed, had circled around behind the Japanese position, had reached a point where he could throw grenades directly into the firing slit. The first grenade went through cleanly. The explosion silenced the machine gun. The second grenade, thrown 5 seconds later, made certain. "Clear!" Dominguez's voice echoed across the volcanic rock. "Position is clear." Caruso lay on the ground, breathing hard, staring up at the gray sky of Iwo Jima. The meat grinder was destroyed. 3 pillboxes, silent and burning. The way was open. The assault on the fortified complex cost Fox Company 3 men killed and 7 wounded. Without Caruso's attack, the battalion commander later estimated the same assault would have cost 50 casualties or more. The official report credited Private First Class Caruso with destroying 2 enemy positions and demonstrating extraordinary courage under fire. Colonel Harrison Blake, the regimental commander, visited Caruso that evening in the aid station where he was having his wounds treated. Blake was a career Marine, a veteran of Guadalcanal and Tarawa, a man who had seen more combat than most officers would see in 3 lifetimes. He stood beside Caruso's cot and looked at the young man from Pennsylvania, at the bandages on his arm and leg, at the eyes that seemed far older than 19. "You did something remarkable today, Marine," Blake said. "The meat grinder has been holding us up for 2 days. You broke it open." Caruso said nothing. He was thinking about Dominguez's diversion, about the 4 Marines who had followed their sergeant into the teeth of the Japanese fire, about how easily the whole thing could have gone wrong. "I'm recommending you for the Navy Cross," Blake continued. "What you did, charging that position, taking out 2 pillboxes with the whole damn enemy army shooting at you, that's beyond the call of duty." "Sir," Caruso said slowly, "Sergeant Dominguez did the hard part. He's the one who should get the medal." Blake studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll make sure Dominguez gets recognized too. But what you did today, don't minimize it. You saved a lot of lives." The Navy Cross recommendation was submitted, but the paperwork was lost somewhere in the chaos of the campaign, and the recommendation was never processed. Caruso continued fighting until March 3rd, when a Japanese mortar round landed within 5 feet of his position. The explosion killed 2 Marines beside him and drove fragments into his back, his legs, and his right arm. He was evacuated to a hospital ship where surgeons spent 4 hours removing shrapnel from his body. They told him his war was over. He had been on Iwo Jima for 12 days. In that time, he had destroyed 11 fortified positions, killed an estimated 60 enemy soldiers, and received 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. The battalion commander recommended him for the Navy Cross, but the paperwork was lost somewhere in the chaos of the campaign, and the recommendation was never processed. Caruso didn't care about medals. He cared about the men he had saved, and the men he hadn't. He cared about the faces that came to him at night, the 14 Marines who had died in those first 11 seconds on the beach, the men whose names he had never learned but whose deaths had sent him crawling toward that first pillbox. He cared about Raymond Dominguez, who had survived the battle only to be killed on Okinawa 3 months later, leading another assault on another fortified position. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. When it was over, 6,821 Americans were dead, and nearly 20,000 were wounded, casualties so severe that it was the only battle in the Pacific War where American losses exceeded Japanese. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated. Of the 21,000 defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest died in the tunnels and pillboxes that General Kuribayashi had built, fighting to the last man, exactly as their commander had ordered. The island became an emergency landing strip for damaged B-29s returning from bombing raids over Japan, exactly as the planners had intended. By war's end, over 2,200 B-29s had made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, carrying crews that would have died in the Pacific if the island had not been secured. Whether the cost was worth the gain, whether 6,821 American dead could be justified by the airmen saved, would be debated for decades. The Marines who fought there had no patience for such debates. They knew only that they had been ordered to take the island, and they had taken it. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other single battle in American history. Vincent Caruso did not receive one of them. His Navy Cross recommendation was lost, his Bronze Star was awarded, and the story of the teenager who had charged machine guns with a flamethrower faded into the vast, bloody history of the Pacific War. Caruso spent 4 months in hospitals, recovering from his wounds. The shrapnel in his back would trouble him for the rest of his life, a dull ache that flared in cold weather, a reminder of the volcanic sand and the burning pillboxes and the screaming that he could never quite forget. He was discharged from the Marine Corps in August 1945, 3 days before the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. He went home to Braddock, Pennsylvania. The steel mills were still running then, and Caruso went back to work at the same plant where his father had worked for 30 years. The foreman welcomed him back, gave him a job on the furnace floor, asked no questions about where he had been or what he had done. Steelmen understood that some things didn't need to be discussed. He married Rose Bertolini in October 1946 in a small ceremony at St. Brendan's Church. Rose had waited for him through the training and the deployment and the long months in the hospital, had written him letters that he kept in a box under his bed, had never pressed him for details about the war. She understood, somehow, that there were doors in Vincent Caruso's mind that should never be opened. They had 5 children, Vincent Jr., Anthony, Marie, Joseph, and little Rosa, born in 1958 when Caruso was 32. They raised them in a small house 3 blocks from the mill, a brick row house with a narrow yard where Caruso grew tomatoes in the summer and shoveled snow in the winter. The neighbors knew him as a quiet man, a hard worker, a devoted father who never raised his voice to his children. They did not know about the nightmares that woke him sweating in the darkness, or the way he flinched at sudden loud noises, or the bottle of whiskey he kept in the garage for the nights when the memories became too much. He never spoke about the war, not to Rose, not to his children, not to the men at the VFW hall who traded stories over beers on Friday nights. When people asked about his service, he would say only that he had been a Marine, that he had been in the Pacific, that he had come home. The flamethrower, the pillboxes, the men who had died beside him, these things stayed locked inside, shared with no one. In 1985, a historian named Dr. William Hastings tracked Caruso down while researching a book about flamethrower tactics in the Pacific War. Hastings had found the after-action reports, had read the citations for Caruso's Bronze Star, had pieced together the story of a teenage steelworker who had charged machine guns with 4 gallons of napalm. He showed up at Caruso's door in Braddock, a tape recorder in his hand, hoping for an interview. Caruso was 59 years old then, still big, still strong, still carrying the shrapnel in his back. He invited Hastings into his kitchen, gave him coffee, and listened to the historian explain what he was researching. "I've read the reports," Hastings said. "What you did on Iwo Jima, charging that first pillbox, the assault on the meat grinder. It's remarkable. You saved dozens of lives, maybe hundreds." Caruso was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the tape recorder, at the historian's eager face, at the photographs on the wall showing his children and grandchildren. Then he shook his head. "I didn't save anyone," he said. "I just did what had to be done. 14 men died in front of me on that beach. Boys, most of them. Kids who never got to go home, never got to have families, never got to grow old." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough. "I think about them every day, every single day. I see their faces when I close my eyes, and I ask myself why I lived and they didn't. 40 years, and I still don't have an answer." Hastings published his book in 1987. A single chapter covered Caruso's actions on Iwo Jima, including excerpts from the interview. The chapter was titled, "The Man Who Walked into Fire." Vincent Anthony Caruso died on November 12, 2008, at the age of 82. Lung disease, the doctors said, possibly related to the toxic fumes he had inhaled from the flamethrower 43 years earlier. He was buried at the National Cemetery of the Alleghenies, his Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts displayed at the funeral. His children and grandchildren gathered around a grave that overlooked the Pennsylvania hills he had loved. At the funeral, his oldest son, Vincent Jr., read a letter that his father had written in 1945 during his long months in the hospital. The letter had been addressed to the families of the 14 Marines who had died on Yellow Beach, but it had never been sent. Caruso had kept it in a drawer for 63 years, unable to mail it, unable to throw it away. "I want you to know that your sons did not die for nothing," the letter read. "They died because they were brave enough to go forward when everything in them must have screamed to go back. They died because they believed in something bigger than themselves. And they died because I was too slow, too scared, too frozen to do what needed to be done in time to save them. I have tried to make up for that. Every bunker I destroyed for them. Every position I attacked in their names. I don't know if it was enough. I don't know if anything could ever be enough. But I want you to know that I remember them. I will always remember them. And as long as I live, I will carry them with me." The letter was never sent. But now, finally, it had been read. 11 fortified positions destroyed. 60 enemy soldiers killed. Hundreds of American lives saved. And a man who spent the rest of his life wondering if he had done enough. The flamethrower that Caruso carried on Iwo Jima was an M2-2, serial number unknown, manufactured by the E. DuPont de Nemours Company in 1944. It was likely destroyed in combat or scrapped after the war. No relic of Vincent Caruso's service survives except his medals, his photographs, and the memories of the men who watched him walk into fire. If you want to hear more forgotten stories from the Second World War, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. These men are gone now. Their story's fading with them. The least we can do is remember. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.